In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at what is duality, understanding dualistic cognition. That's quite a mouthful there, but this is a very, very foundational topic. And you're probably thinking, Leo, I've heard you talking about duality a bunch already, so what more is there to say? Well, actually, I've spent the last 2 years compiling a list of dualities, or dualistic categories that the mind uses to try to understand reality. And so this episode and the next one, it's going to be a mini series here, probably 2 parts, maybe a third part. I'm not sure how much I can cram into 2 episodes. I'll try to do it in 2. But in these 2 episodes, I'm going to give you my master list of over 250 very common and important dualities. And this is going to help you to understand how your mind makes sense of all of life, the entire world. So this is very foundational stuff, and I haven't really covered it as directly as I'm going to cover it here. And I'm going to address every single one of these dualities to lesser or greater degree. And we're going to break them apart into 3 groups. The first one is going to be just common dualities. The second group is going to be scientific types of dualities for scientific thinking. And the final category or group is going to be existential dualities. So the most important part of this series is going to be part 2. So make sure you stick around for part 2. I get the sense that most people, they watch part 1, they get bored with it halfway through, and then they never get to part 2. But part 2 is usually the most important part of my series, or the last part of the series is always the most important because we're building something up throughout the series. That's why the series is needed in the first place, because there's a lot of content. So I've been compiling this list for a couple of years. I want you to understand how much work and thought goes into this, thinking about this stuff. So let's begin. So what you got to understand is that the human mind, when it tries to understand things, the way that it thinks, and in fact, all thinking is basically dualistic. You cannot think, you cannot speak, you cannot write, you cannot communicate, you cannot do science even, nor philosophy, or any other kind of intellectual human activity without creating dualities. Dualities are like the structure of the entire universe and the way we come to know the entire universe. Every concept that we have you noticed? It's defined against its opposite. So if we have a concept like energy, then the only value of that idea of energy is precisely that it designates something which is distinct from some other thing which is not energy. Because if everything was energy, then in a sense, you couldn't use the idea of energy in any practical way, because every time you spoke of it, you'd be speaking about the entire universe. So it wouldn't really be a handy word or a handy concept. And so when we're thinking, we're creating these dualities all the time with our mind. We're doing it when we're doing science. We're doing it when we're in casual conversation. We're doing it when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about religion, when we're talking about our opinions about things. And of course, we're doing it when we're doing philosophy, or we're trying to understand the nature of ourselves or reality or anything else. But the problem is that we create these dualities, but we're not conscious of the fact that these are dualities. And this leads us astray. So firstly, you got to understand that your understanding of the world is composed of these dualities. What do I mean by these dualities? I mean, for example, things like up versus down. That would be a duality. You're defining up, but up is defined relative to down, such that you can't have a down without an up, and you can't have an up without a down. This seems very simple. It seems very obvious. And of course, in the case of up and down, it is very simple and very obvious. But not always. In fact, there was a time when most people on the planet did not understand and appreciate the relativity of the notion of up and down. They literally thought that there was an up direction in the universe and a down direction in the universe. And that objects just naturally fell down. That's what objects did. Of course, later we realized that that's not how gravity works. It took a genius like Newton to realize that up and down are relative. And of course, the Greeks before him realized it as well. I'm also talking about dualities like success versus failure, or reality versus fantasy, or life versus death, or good versus bad, or science versus religion. So even though most people understand that up and down are relative notions, and that they depend and are defined in relationship to each other, such that you can't have one without the other, they then don't understand that when it comes to other categories. And they don't understand that their own mind is creating these categories. So it's relatively easy to see how the human mind is creating the category of up versus down, which doesn't exist in nature otherwise. But it's a lot harder to see how the human mind is creating the category of life versus death, or good versus bad, or reality versus fantasy, or science versus religion. These things, they seem like they're out there in the real world and not something that our mind is creating. But of course, the distinction between your mind and the world, what is that but another duality? You see? So everything that you say and any model that you construct of the world, it always relies upon these dualities. But the problem is that there's a very fundamental law of epistemology that I want to share with you that you really need to start to appreciate, is that all dualities are ultimately untenable and temporary. All dualities are ultimately relative, and they must eventually collapse. This is something that we don't like to accept because it's very threatening, because we build our lives and our societies and our cultures upon certain unquestioned categories and dualities. For example, man versus woman. In a lot of cultures, what is a man and what is a woman is very strictly defined by certain conventions and traditions and orthodoxies, and then it's taken as an absolute, not as a relative thing. And then people struggle with that, especially when you start to blend and blur gender roles and identities. So all conventional, traditional, orthodox, and even scientific cognition is dualistic. You have to understand. Have you looked at how conservatives, for example, think about politics and gender and religion and the world? It's extremely dualistic. Now, of course, liberals are not completely free of dualistic thinking either. Most liberals are full of dualistic categories, but they're a little bit less dualistic. And so as you become more conscious, you become less and less dualistic, and you start to realize that more and more of the dualities that you thought were fundamental and unquestionable, the lines between them start to blur, and you start to see the interrelationship between these various polar opposites that you've always just taken for granted since you were a child, because your culture just told you that they were true. So, one corollary of this law of epistemology, that all dualities are ultimately untenable, and the reason that is, by the way, is because reality, of course, is non-dual. That's why all dualities are untenable, is that dualities only hold when they are not deeply explored. So you can create a category like man versus woman, or man versus machine, or progress versus regress. And it might seem at first glance that, well, yeah, it's pretty, there's a pretty clear line, Leo, there's a pretty clear line between, for example, man versus machine. It's not hard to distinguish those two. But what I'm telling you is that, yes, it's not hard to distinguish those two, and usually it's not hard to distinguish a man from a woman, but there are edge cases that you're not taking into account. And also what's going to happen is that as we move forward into the future, you're going to see that these dualities start to bleed into each other more and more, to the point where maybe 500 or 1,000 years from now, it will be pretty hard to distinguish a man from a machine. Already we have human beings who have pacemakers, which are machine components embedded into the body, various kinds of implants, artificial hips and knees made out of titanium and other kinds of metals and new materials. And this is just going to keep happening more and more and more, to the point where, like, seriously, like in 500 years, society culturally is going to have a problem distinguishing a man from a machine. And then, questions will arise, of course, as they do in science fiction movies about, do machines deserve human rights, the same rights that a man has, that a woman has? Or do machines have a different set of rights? Is it, for example, is it ethical and moral to force a machine to work 20 hours a day in a factory without any rest or relaxation? Is that ethical? Well, right now, it's not a problem because it's easy to distinguish man from machine, but it's going to get harder and harder and harder. Another example is, like I cited, progress versus regress. A lot of people, especially progressive people, liberals, they tend to have a very simplistic, dualistic notion of progress versus regress. And so they see the conservatives as being the ones who are regressing society, and then the progressives or the liberals, they're the ones who are progressing or advancing society. And generally, we tend to look at the world and we see, well, that case right there is either a case of progress or regress. But it's not so simple, because what you're not taking into account is how the two play into each other. In a certain kind of liberal progressive fantasy, you might imagine that, well, wouldn't it be great if there were no conservatives and all we had was just pure progress all the time? We're always hitting the accelerator with no brake. This is a dualistic delusion and fantasy. It can't be that way, because reality always has complementary and opposite forces that are at play with each other. And oftentimes what ends up happening is that in order for us to progress, we first need to regress. And you can notice that both collectively throughout history, in how societies and cultures and nations evolve, but you can also see it individually within yourself, in your own life. There are moments in your life where you're going to be progressing, and there are going to be moments in your life where you're going to be backsliding and regressing. And we tend to get we tend to feel guilty when we're regressing in our lives, especially with personal development. If you're a self-help junkie, then you get guilty about this stuff. And you just have this, again, this kind of self-improvement fantasy of like, well, what if I could just be progressing all the time with no backsliding and no hiccups whatsoever? But again, that's a dualistic delusion. It can't be that way. And you need to understand that your progress comes about precisely oftentimes because of your regresses. So those moments when you're the most depressed, when you're backsliding the most, when you're cheating on your diet, when you're cheating on your plans, and you're failing to fall through on your goals, it's your failure, which then ultimately leads you to your next great success. But most people think way too dualistically, too simplistically, too much black and white, to see these dialectical interplays that happen between these opposing forces. And also, of course, you have to recognize that these categories of like man versus machine, progress versus regress, these are not just found in the world as if they're just kind of floating around in the universe somewhere. These are things that your own mind is creating. Your own mind is defining what is a man and what is a machine. And so, of course, you should expect that the categories that your mind comes up with, they're not going to be able to be true to ultimate reality. They're not going to be absolute. None of your categories are going to be absolute. Same thing with progress or regress. Nothing in the universe, there's no like book in the universe that's floating around in space that you can go and you can look up and see, okay, here's a list of what qualifies as progress, and here's a list of stuff that qualifies as regress. No, we're determining what progress and regress are. And so a lot of what politics is about is it's a battle about how to define various terms, whether it's man versus machine or progress or regress or man versus woman or anything else like that. So what I'm telling you here, we're still talking about this one corollary of this law of epistemology, that all dualities collapse. So the corollary is that if you deeply explore any duality to its ultimate root, what you will discover is that as you get further and further away to the edges of this duality, is you will see it collapse and bleed, and the edges will come back and circle back around and embrace each other in a unity. And you will realize that the entire time the two were defined in terms of one another. Because fundamentally what you're doing is you're using your mind to place boundaries within reality. And so you're carving up reality, but then who is carving up reality? Well, you carve it up one way, your neighbor carves it up another way, I carve it up another way, and then we all disagree because we've carved it up in different ways. And then who gets to say which way of carving it up is the best way? Well, of course, that depends on your goals, that depends on your survival agenda, that depends on what your ego needs, but we don't admit of that. Usually what we say is we just say, well, no, my duality is just the way that reality is. It's not something that I created. It's not something relative. It's how it actually is. And my way is the right way. It has nothing to do with me. This problem of drawing lines within reality is really tricky. It's notoriously tricky. In philosophy, this is known as the Heep Problem. How do you define what a heap is? So if you take a couple of grains of sand and you put them together, does that constitute a heap or just a few grains of sand? Well, you might say it's just a few grains of sand. Okay, but then if we take 1,000,000 of them, 1,000,000 grains of sand, put them together, would that be a heap? You'd say, yeah, it's probably a heap. Okay, but where do you draw the line between a few grains of sand and a heap? Is it 10 grains, 100 grains, 1,000 grains? Who gets to say? If I say it's 100 and you say it's 1,000, which one of us is right? See? But this goes way beyond just grains of sand. It's much more significant. I'll give you a scientific example. For example, a lot of scientists and people who follow all the space launches that are happening these days with various companies, they argue about what qualifies as outer space. What is outer space? We have the Earth, and then we have outer space. But how many miles above the Earth is outer space? Is it 50,000, 60,000, 120,000, or 120 miles above, not thousand, hundreds of miles above the Earth? What qualifies as outer space? Do you have to actually be in geosynchronous orbit? Do you have to be out of Earth's orbit to be in outer space? Or is it enough for you just to fly out the atmosphere? Is a jumbo jet in outer space when it's flying? Speaking of which, where is that boundary? If you really think about it, I'm sitting in outer space right now because there's no boundary between where I'm sitting right now and, 120 miles up there, which would be considered outer space by most scientists. Well, there's no boundary. I mean, outer space is right here. Of course, there's air here, but the space is all the same. So you see, so who's defining this? So a lot of debates and misunderstanding and miscommunication and confusion comes precisely because of this, because we're drawing these lines, but we're not admitting that we're drawing these lines. Or here's another example. When does a molecule or a collection of molecules become a living cell? Who determines that? Is there some law in the universe that says, well, if you have 100,000 molecules arranged in this fashion, then all of a sudden now it's a living cell, but before it wasn't? See? Or going up a little bit further, another level up from that is, when do a clump of cells become a human? This is a very tricky issue for abortion rights and for religious people when they think about reproductive rights. Who's defining when a clump of cells equals a human? Is it precisely at the moment where the egg meets the sperm? It's and does the egg just need to touch the sperm for it to be a human, or does the sperm have to actually enter into the egg and then stay there for some time? And how many seconds does it need to stay? How many minutes? How many hours? Who gets to say? See, it's very tricky. Or how about the question of when did an ape become a human? Yeah. It's pretty easy to tell a chimpanzee apart from a human, but there was a time in the past where there existed hominids, something between a chimpanzee and a human, some common ancestor, and it must have had traits very similar to half chimpanzee, half human, something quite similar to that. I mean, there are plenty of fossils in the fossil record to give us good evidence of this. And it must have acted really similar to humans in certain ways, but also it wasn't quite human. Is a Neanderthal a human or not? See, really interesting. So when did the first human get born? Really interesting question. And who determines that was a human? Is it the human that's born and says, I'm a human? But then, of course, that's very self-biased because, of course, yeah, you get to say you're a human, but does that really mean that you're a human? What if you teach a hominid, a Neanderthal, to say that it's a human? Does that mean it is? And does it have human rights at that point? See how tricky it gets? How about what determines when a computer becomes intelligent? That's very tricky as well. Very tricky problem in computer science. And that problem is going to only become more and more thorny in the next couple hundred years as all these AIs become more sophisticated and more developed. It's going to become harder and harder to distinguish human intelligence from computer intelligence. So that's very interesting. It used to be thought that, well, if a computer could beat a man at chess, then it would be intelligent. Well, that happened in the late 90s. And but we still don't consider computers intelligent. So what is that boundary there? How about the boundary between a thought and an emotion? When does a thought become an emotion? And when does an emotion become a thought? Have you ever noticed this? How closely related the two are? And oftentimes, though, we talk about them as though they're two different things. Like, well, I'm thinking now and I'm feeling something else later. But then, of course, they're very related because what you're thinking now affects how you feel later. And in fact, people have been asking about this on the Actualized forum. They've been asking about pain. Is pain a thought or is pain an emotion and a feeling? Well, of course, the answer is that pain is a complicated thing which includes both a thought component and an emotional component. And if you understood that and you became fully conscious of that, that might allow you to overcome some serious chronic pain that you're having that otherwise you wouldn't be able to overcome because you're not conscious of the interplay between thoughts and emotions and how that affects the pain you feel or the suffering you feel. Most of the suffering you feel is thought-driven and not just purely a feeling or a sensation. Or how about, where do you draw the line between love and hatred? Where does love end and hatred begin? Now you might think, well, Leo, these are two clearly different things. There's no problem distinguishing love from hatred. They're opposites. Really? Are they really? See, it seems like they're opposites, but then when you, like I tell you, if you really explore the duality in a lot of detail and you go all the way out to its edges, you're going to see that they're going to loop back around and come together. For example, a lot of people who are filled with hate are actually filled with love for some partial thing within reality. So, for example, a man who feels hatred towards someone who physically abused his daughter, is he acting out of hatred or out of love? You might think, well, he's acting out of hatred for that guy who beat up his daughter, and that's wrong and that's evil, and so he's right to hate that guy because he shouldn't have slapped around the daughter. Okay, that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is that really he's doing out of love. His hatred is out of love, you see, because he loves his daughter so much. So, see, it's not so simple. Not so simple at all. And in fact, for that guy who's filled with this hatred, in order to overcome his hatred, he's going to have to recognize that there's this interplay between these various forces within him. So it's not just hatred, it's also love. And he needs to recognize that hatred itself comes from a certain partial kind of love. And when you realize that, then you can kind of let go of that and you can expand your love to even include those objects that you hate. And that's exactly what you need to do in order to have a non-dual living experience of life. So our goal ultimately is to sort of take the rigidity of all these categories and then shake it loose so that you're liberated and you're free. Your mind is free to explore reality without being straitjacketed by all these categories that you've constructed or that your culture has constructed and programmed you with. But of course, the problem with that is precisely that our mind is so rigid and so closed from exploring and breaking apart these rigidities. We don't want to explore these dualities too deeply, because if we do, ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to get not just to the simple dualities of like ape versus human or man versus machine. These are simple. They don't affect your life too much one way or another. They're kind of philosophical, you might almost say. But you start going down this rabbit hole, eventually you're going to start to get to dualities like reality versus fantasy, or sanity versus insanity, or good versus evil. Oh boy, now we're getting into existential dualities, and these really are the things that shape how you perceive the entire world and shape your entire attitude towards people, things, yourself, and the world. And these are very, very practical and significant and not just merely philosophical. And most people don't want to question these dualities. They don't want to admit of the possibility that the boundary between reality and fantasy might not actually exist, for example, or that the boundary between the mind and the world, the inner mind and the outer world, might not actually exist, or that boundary between the mind and the brain. Scientists love to cling to that boundary, and they love to prioritize the brain over the mind, such that the mind is inside the brain rather than the opposite possibility. See, so you start to play around with this stuff, and all of a sudden, you get into some very mind-bending territory, and a lot of stuff becomes very fluid, and your reality starts to melt before your eyes and fall apart, and that can be very scary and very threatening, which is why most people don't want to go down this route. So for now, I just want you to remember that your mind creates categories, and then what it does is that it cleverly denies that it created these categories. And this is how reality arises, which of course is itself a category. All these words that I use, mind, creation, denial, world, self, category, good, love, what are these? These are all categories. Even the word category is a category. And so by denying that we create these categories, this creates enormous degrees of ignorance, resulting in deep misunderstandings of how reality works. As a consequence, human understanding is then very partial, biased, and lopsided, and very confused. Mankind tends to hold these dualities and categories as sacred, as dogmas, trying to resist their collapse. But of course, one of the key laws of epistemology is that every duality will eventually be subverted. So just keep that in mind. So with that introduction out of the way, let's actually get into the list of these dualities. So let's start with some very simple ones that don't need that much explanation. Up versus down, left versus right, east versus west, hot versus cold, soft versus hard, small versus big, front versus back, forward versus backward, clockwise versus counterclockwise. So you've heard all these before. You learned them when you were young as a child, and to you, they just seem very obvious. But I want you just to start to notice that always these are relative terms. defined in terms of each other. So for example, what do I mean? Well, let's just take left and right. Is this left or is this right? Or is this right and this left? It depends on whether you're looking at it from this direction or from that direction. So for me, this is right, but for you it's left, and vice versa. And it's important to understand that. In fact, I had to teach myself as I was shooting all these videos over the years, I had to teach myself that when I'm talking and I'm presenting something to you, I have to point in this direction. Like if I'm trying to show you a graph of my progress, if like, let's say I'm showing you my progress in personal development, I'm growing, right? See, I have to draw it this way because from your perspective, that's the right way. But from my perspective, it's backwards. So I have to train myself to think backwardsly as I'm showing stuff to you through this camera. And a lot of times I watch, for example, CNN or some other news network, and some expert that they have there is sitting there and he's trying to draw some sort of graph with his fingers. But the way he's drawing it backwards from the viewer's perspective because he's drawing it from his own perspective. And I can see that he didn't train himself to look at what he's doing from the viewer's perspective. See? So this just gives you a little example of how powerful it is to be able to look at the world from other people's perspectives, because then you can present information in ways that will work for that person. That, of course, facilitates communication, facilitates relationships, facilitates teaching, but it also facilitates understanding the other person, which is very rare, very rare. It's very rare that people go to great lengths to try to understand somebody else's perspective. Usually people are just stuck in their own perspective. All right, so left and right is relative, and as are all these other things. Who gets to define, for example, what qualifies as forward versus backward? Let's go on with the rest of the list. Weak versus strong, slow versus fast, easy versus hard, smooth versus rough, short versus long, empty versus full, odd versus even. You might think, well, Leo, odd and even, that's very clear cut. That's a mathematical notion. So it should be easy to know if something is odd or even. Well, let me ask you this. Is 0 even or odd? Is pi, the number pi, 3.14159, etc., is that even or odd? See, so when you start to think too simplistically with these categories, what they do is they limit your imagination. See, if you take a little child and you teach him about even and odd, and you tell him all numbers are even and odd, one or the other. At first glance, he's just going to believe you and he's going to accept it. It's going to look from his perspective, it's going to seem like, yeah, that's right. Look, here's number 1, it's odd. Here's number 6, it's even. Here's a number 500, it's even, and so forth. He can go through a few examples and he can learn the distinction of odd versus even. But then you ask the child, what about 0? And now he gets confused. He doesn't know how to answer that. Or you give him a decimal point and he doesn't know. Is it odd? Is it even? Is it neither? You see, when he then understands that, oh, even and odd doesn't automatically apply to all numbers, then that sort of opens up a new possibility for him. But imagine a child who's just been taught from an early age in a dogmatic fashion that numbers must always be odd or only be even. And that this is just like a brute fact of the universe, is that if it's a number, it has to be odd or even, and it can't be both, and it can't be neither. You see, he's going to have real difficulty in the future when he does advanced mathematics and he's dealing with fractions and decimals and imaginary numbers and transcendental numbers and God knows what else. He's going to have a real difficulty with that. So that's sort of what we're dealing with here. A lot of the stuff that I try to communicate through my speaking is these sorts of advanced mathematical concepts, to use this analogy. But many of the people that I'm communicating with, they're using this very simple black and white dualistic thinking to try to understand some of these trans-rational truths that I'm trying to communicate. And then what ends up happening is that it doesn't compute for them. It doesn't make sense. And then, of course, if it doesn't make sense for you, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you're missing out on the most advanced wisdom and lessons from life. See? So you have to evolve your cognition in order to be able to really understand the deepest truths. That's why we're talking about all this. Moving on with the list. High versus low. Decrease versus increase. Heads versus tails. Narrow versus broad. Shallow versus deep. These are all relative. You know, what I consider a shallow book, for me, a shallow book might be a very deep book for you. Just depends. If you're just a newbie getting into self-help, then most books will seem very deep to you, which, for example, to me, after I've been doing it for 5 or 10 years, now seem very shallow, aren't really worth my time. And of course, it depends. Depends on where you are on your personal development journey. And what I consider a deep book today is going to turn into a shallow book 10 years from now. See? But most people, you know, they don't really appreciate this relative nature of these categories. And now on the list, we get to the category of good versus bad and good versus evil. And this is a very important one. And we're going to pause right here in order to introduce an additional concept that we're going to need as we're talking about these dualities going forward. And that is the concept of the absolute or the transcendent. So usually we set up a category like good, which is defined as the opposite of bad. And then what I'm going to tell you now is that they're relative. Good and bad is relative. So what's good for me might be bad for you, and vice versa. For example, if the government confiscates all your money and gives it to me, that's good for me, but it's bad for you, and vice versa. Of course, it can also do something that would be good for both of us, or bad for both of us, but might be good for some other group. Like, for example, if we're, if you and I are in the upper class of society and the government starts taxing the upper class, well, that's bad for us, but it'll be good for the lower class. So most people don't even admit this about good and bad, how relative it is to our self-agenda. So that's just a basic point of relativity. But some people then get trapped in the trap of relativity, and they think, well, all good and bad is just relative, and that's the end of the story. Except it's not the end of the story. So in certain cases, there are absolutes. So with the case of good and bad, there's absolute good. What is an absolute? Well, that's a deep topic. I'll have actually an episode in the future about what is an absolute and what is absolute truth. And we're also going to be talking about absolute and relative in the future as well, because there's so much to say about that. But briefly here, an absolute is that which has no opposite, is transcendent of this duality. So for example, when I say good as an absolute, or good with a capital G, this is a good that knows no opposite, that has no opposite. So really what it does is it takes the lowercase g good and the lowercase b bad, and it sort of recognizes them as a duality, and then it incorporates all of that and transcends it at the same time. And that unity is what we're calling good with a capital G. Now, of course, someone's going to wonder here, well, Leo, but what about bad with a capital B? Isn't there an absolute bad as well if there's an absolute good? No, there isn't, because if there were, that would again create a new duality. So what I'm talking about is good as a non-duality. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, if you're merging the lowercase g good with the lowercase b bad, you're merging those together into one thing. Why are you then calling it good with an uppercase G? Aren't you being biased? Shouldn't you give it some neutral term? And the answer is no. Because from an absolute level of consciousness, what you can realize is that there actually never was such a thing as bad. Bad was always a relative notion, and as an absolute, all there ever was good. So all that stuff you thought was bad was actually always good, but it wasn't the lowercase g good, it was the uppercase g good. So I understand this is a bit confusing and all, but this is a very powerful notion that I want you to understand, because we're going to be coming back to it over and over and over again, especially in part 2 of this series. So keep that in your back pocket. And while we're talking about this, let me, of course, bring up the very well-known symbol of the Yin-Yang sign. This is the universal symbol of non-duality and also duality. So understand that non-duality contains within it, incorporates within it duality. So non-duality is a transcendent or absolute, which contains within it. Here you see the white and the black. The white, let's say, is the good or the light. The dark is the bad or the shadow. But notice that the symbol requires both parts in order to be complete. So you might focus on the white and think of that as the good with the lowercase g. You can focus on the black and see that as the lowercase b bad. And then you can look at the entire symbol and see the totality of it as a whole. And what that is that's the unification of everything, and that is the transcendental or the absolute with a capital A. See? And also what I want you to notice here is that, very interestingly, there's a dot. In each of these teardrop shapes, there's a dot. So the black has a dot of white, and the white has a dot of black. So that's very important, because what that is communicating to you is that there's this dialectical interplay, and that it's not so simple to separate the white from the black or the good from the bad. Always within the good, you're going to find a little bit of the bad, and always within the bad, you're going to find a little bit of the good. Kind of like that example I was giving you with the love and the hate. See, there's this kind of dialectical interplay. There's this interconnectivity between whatever categories you create within reality. And so just keep that in mind. There is a sort of unacknowledged unity that we are denying, which you will start to admit and see more and more of as you become more conscious and do more of this work. So let's keep going with the list. Right versus wrong. This is very similar to good versus bad. And on this duality, we can also say that there is an absolute, R, with a capital, right with a capital R. That would be the absolute, which is when you realize that everything is right. There's no such thing as wrong. See, you can become so conscious that you realize that wrong is just a concept, and that everything is perfectly right. Going on with the list, positive versus negative. You can also realize that there is a positive with a capital P, positive as an absolute, such that you become so conscious that you realize that there's no such thing as a negative. Everything's a positive. There's a relative negative, but as an absolute, there's only positive. Are you following me? I know it's a little tricky. It's tricky because most people don't have a reference experience for what the word absolute means. So when I say absolute, if you've never experienced or become conscious of the absolute, then you don't know what that word means. It might sound like a belief or an idea. The absolute is not a belief or an idea. It's something you can become directly conscious of. It's a way of looking at the world. Let's just say for now, it's a more accurate way of looking at the world from a higher consciousness elevation. Next on the list is moral versus immoral. This trips a lot of people up. A lot of people believe that certain things are just fundamentally, absolutely moral, and other things are absolutely immoral. And in fact, our legal system is sort of built upon this fiction of this duality. In fact, our entire sense of morality and even a lot of our emotional system is built upon this fiction of this duality. Because when we think that someone did something immoral, usually the way we think of it is that that guy did something truly immoral, truly evil and wrong. And so he deserves punishment. He deserves to go to prison. He deserves to be executed. He deserves whatever suffering he's receiving from the universe for that. He deserves his bad karma or something like this. See? And then, of course, we get angry when that person doesn't get whatever we think he deserves for being immoral. But you always have to wonder, who is determining what is moral and what is immoral? Have you noticed that every tribe of humans across the entire planet, across all the different eras that humans have been alive, have had their own unique senses and notions of what's moral and what's immoral? Oftentimes exactly the opposite. How can that be the case? Well, it's because actually moral and immoral are relative. They're not absolute. So one of the key mistakes that people make here, especially if they're at spiral dynamic stage blue level of development or below, is they mistake, for example, lowercase g good and lowercase g b bad. They mistake these two as if they're absolute rather than relative. Because stage blue is very absolutistic in the way that it thinks. It's absolutistic cognition. So beware of this trap. All of your morality, all of your ethics, everything you think is positive or negative or right or wrong or good or bad or evil, all of that I'm telling you right now is relative. And on top of that, there is an absolute, but the absolute is not what you think it is. It's not what you think it is. In fact, it's usually the opposite of what you think it is, which is why this is so tricky. So most fundamentalist religious people, the thing they think is the absolute is actually relative. The thing they think is moral is actually just a fiction of their own mind. But there is an absolute that they could access. There is a good with a capital G that they could access, but they'll never access it precisely because they're so stuck on defending this relative duality as if it were absolute, you see? So they're clinging to a false absolute is the problem, which prevents them from being able to access the true absolute. And of course, to make this all even more confusing, true and false, we'll be talking about that in part 2, is itself a duality that you're creating. But on top of all that, there is an absolute truth, which is not something you're creating. Got it? Okay, good. Now we'll be talking more about it in part 2. We're getting ahead of our skis here. Next on the list, should versus shouldn't. This makes a lot of people feel very guilty and bad about themselves. Is they think that there's stuff they should be doing and stuff they shouldn't be doing. And they take it as absolutes. That's sort of the whole function of the notion of a should, is if something should be done, that means everyone has to do it. It should be done. Like, you should not kill people. That's an absolute. Well, really, it's not an absolute. It's a relative. Because, of course, we kill people in war. We kill criminals. We kill all sorts of people. All the time, people are getting killed. But still, we have this absolute silly idea that people shouldn't get killed. But you can transcend that and you can get to should as an absolute. Should as an absolute with a capital S is simply everything that is. So whatever is happening in the universe right now is precisely what should be happening, such that there isn't any shouldn'ts. There's only shoulds. So is there a war going on that you don't like? Well, you tell yourself it shouldn't happen. Actually, it should, because it is happening. So therefore it should. And whatever else you think shouldn't be happening, if it's happening, it should be happening. Who are you to question what should be happening? Really, as an absolute, what you realize is that everything that is happening is what should be happening. And there's no such thing as something that shouldn't be happening because you're fully accepting it. So what you realize is that the notion of something that should not be happening is itself a fantasy. And then you surrender that and you just accept everything exactly as it is. And that's what should be happening. And now you don't have a constant back and forth anymore between should and shouldn't. And in general, that's the whole value of realizing the true absolute. When you realize the true absolute, you transcend the pettiness of the sort of bickering and dialectical tug of war that goes on between these relative dualistic notions. So you rise above good and evil. You rise above should and shouldn't. You rise above morality and immorality. But that threatens a lot of people because they think, well, Leo, but if I'm going to rise above good and evil, that means what? I'm going to be okay with evil happening? But that's not what it means. But yet at the same time, that is what it means. So it's tricky. It's very tricky. You're transcending both of them. You just have to trust that when you truly transcend both of them, what you're going to end up with is something better than what you had at the level below, where you were stuck in this tug of war. So this is how liberation is achieved. Have you noticed how much tug of war there is going on within life, in the news, in politics, in religion, in science, in academia, in universities, at your job, within your family, within yourself? Everything's a tug of war. So, in a certain sense, what we're looking for with spiritual work and with personal development is to rise above the fray, as they say, and to transcend this tug of war. How do you do it? Well, you can't do it by engaging in more tug of war. You need something new. You need something meta, which is a higher elevation above the tug of war. So, for example, if you're in some political battle and your opponent is slinging mud at you, well, you have an option. One option is to sling mud back, and then you get into a tug of war. I'm right, he's wrong. And then, of course, he says that he's right and that I'm wrong. And then this tug of war goes back and forth and some debate starts. And this is very unproductive. And you see this everywhere. You see this, for example, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the sort of tug of war that never ends. You see, both sides are fighting with each other, not really understanding the other side. So the solution is to rise above that. How do you rise above it? Well, that requires becoming conscious of transcendent absolutes, which, of course, most people are too busy engaging in the tug of war, in the debate, in the conflict, in the battle, in the struggle, to have time to become conscious of the transcendent and the absolute. Because if they became conscious of the absolute, that whole conflict would automatically melt away. And it wouldn't exist as a problem for you anymore. In fact, problems and solutions, what is that but another duality? See? So long as you believe in that duality, so long as your mind is creating that duality, then you're always going to have problems. Have you noticed that every problem you have, you create a solution for, and then just another problem pops up? And you never run out of problems. Life is just a never-ending stream of problems. Wouldn't it be nice to find a way to transcend that? Well, then what you need is the ultimate solution. And what is the ultimate solution? Well, that would be awakening. Waking up from the dualistic dream that you're stuck in. Next, continuing down the list, worst versus best. How many times have you got caught up in this duality, trying to determine, well, who's the worst, who's the best out of all these people or out of all these objects? Judging and evaluating and ranking, and then arguing with other people. Like you and your friends start arguing about what's the best movie, what's the worst movie, and then everyone has a different opinion, right? Because it's relative. How about sad versus happy? This is very tricky. A lot of people who get into personal development really what they're looking for is happiness. But they don't really understand how tricky and counterintuitive happiness is. They think they can get happiness by developing themselves, being successful, getting money, getting a six-pack abs, and getting a hot girlfriend or a nice husband or whatever else. They think this will make them happy. Of course, not realizing that you can't just have happiness without sadness, because the way that you're defining happiness is just one polar end of this duality. And so the way that you're going about life, you're going to have a lot of sadness as you're simultaneously creating a lot of happiness. And at some point, you're going to get fed up with this sadness, and you're going to say, fuck, man, I want true happiness. Is there a possibility for transcending this back and forth tug of war, this up and down between being happy and sad? I'm tired of this. I want peace. And I'll do whatever it takes to get peace. And then you do that, and then finally you awaken and you realize that to transcend happiness and sadness, you discover the absolute, which is happiness with a capital H. You transcend both of them, and then you can be happy all the time without sadness. But that's something that's completely outside the realm of possibility for most human beings, because they're stuck in this dualistic, relativistic tug of war between their emotions. Continuing on with the list, old versus new. Have you noticed how everything new becomes old very, very quickly? What's new today will become old tomorrow. Fashions, video games, movies, technology. Take the newest smartphone that came out this week. Well, it's going to be old news by next year. Interesting how that works. So is there actually anything new, you might wonder, in the universe? Is there actually anything old? See? What's old? Is the first iPhone, is that old? Or is some dinosaur bone that's 50 million years, is that old? Or is some galaxy, which is billions of years old, or is that old? See, it's all relative. Who gets to say? And then, of course, these terms are always context sensitive. So when we're talking about technology, we're using a very narrow span of time when we're talking about old and new. Usually if it's more than a year, then it's old as far as technology, within the context of technology. But when we're talking about in the context of dinosaurs or astrophysics or societies, then now we're talking about thousands of years, millions and billions of years. How about moving on with the list, foreground versus background, inefficient versus efficient, useful versus useless. This one is really important. People don't realize that usefulness is relative. So whether something is useful to you depends on who you are and what you need to survive. Consider the following possibility, that if you weren't you, and if you didn't need to survive, then nothing would be useful to you. Or just more practically, if your goals change, then usefulness changes too. Maybe you have some goal in life, like you have the goal of earning a lot of money. So then you look at the whole world and perceive it in terms of what's useful and what's useless to you in terms of achieving that goal. So maybe a relationship or a marriage, time with your kids, that might all be useless if your goal is to earn the most money. But then your goal changes, and now your goal is love, to maximize love in your life and not to maximize money. Let's say you get to that point in your development. Well, now all of a sudden, a lot of useless stuff now all of a sudden looks very useful to you. It's useful towards maximizing love. So now spending time with your children and with your family, and maybe doing some charity work and doing some meditation and whatever else now, or some psychedelics maybe. Now all that has become very useful. And now running your business, that's become useless. Looking at your bank account and counting your money, that's become useless to you now. See? Not only is it useless, it's actually negative. It detracts from your time pursuing love, for example. Not to say that they necessarily have to be in opposition. You can earn lots of money doing stuff you love, for example. So again, they're not opposites. You always have a little speck of one within the other. Sometimes a lot of speck, not just a speck, but an entire ocean of one within the other. Going down the list, boring versus exciting. Have you noticed how relative boring and exciting are? Some game that you just buy, some video game you play, it's the hottest, newest game. It's so exciting. You're playing it. And then a week later, now it's boring. Did the game change? Nothing in the game changed. It's all you. Your mind is doing it. It's crazy. Crazy how that works, huh? Sometimes you're sitting there meditating, you're bored out of your mind. Other times you're sitting there meditating, you're excited. Because like your meditation is going good, you're in the zone, you're locked in, you're all focused, you feel like you're getting some good gains out of it. Now it's exciting for you. And then you get bored again. How do you transcend that so that your life is always exciting? Exciting with a capital E, is that possible? Maybe. Maybe. Could it be that boredom is something that your mind is doing? Maybe. Going down the list, here versus there, near versus far, rich versus poor. You know, it's funny. It's so funny because with rich and poor, a lot of people think that rich and poor are like these fixed categories, but of course they're not. Even the poorest person in America, let's say, still lives like a king compared to how people lived 2,000 years ago. Even the most lavish kings, like think about the pharaohs of Egypt or some, some emperor of Rome or whatever, you would think, well, these were the richest people in the world and they lived lavishly, but they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have ice cream, they didn't have fast food McDonald's that you can buy for $5. They didn't have cars, they didn't have a bunch of stuff. So, I mean, we're all in the 21st century living like rich kings. And yet it's still not enough for you. You're still miserable. So this tells you that it doesn't matter how rich or how poor you are. Of course, rich and poor is also relative in the sense that what really matters is how rich or how poor are you relative to the people you surround yourself with. See, if you're the richest among all your friends, you're going to feel pretty good. Whereas if you're the poorest among all your friends, even if you're, let's say, you got $1 million, but all your friends have $100 million, are you going to be happy? Of course not. You're going to be miserable. You're going to feel poor. Like you're really going to feel poor because you're going to see all your $100 million friends, buying expensive yachts and helicopters and other things, not jumbo jets, but private jets, let's say, and you won't be able to afford those with $1 million. But you see, when even a poorer person looks at that situation, they think, well, that's just ridiculous. That's so ridiculous. If I had $1 million, I wouldn't be like that. I would be happy. I don't need yachts and helicopters and private jets. Right. That's because right now you're so poor that you only have like $10,000. If you're earning a couple dozen, like what? Let's say you're earning $30,000 a year. If that's your salary, then of course $1 million to you is like a pipe dream. It's a fantasy. You think it's going to make you happy until you get it. And then what you'll realize is that it's not all it's cracked up to be. And then you're actually going to be depressed. You're going to be depressed when you get it because that fantasy is going to be rudely popped. That little bubble of yours is going to be popped. So I'm telling you all this so that your mind becomes flexible enough to see this relativity. Then you can start to like look into the future and kind of start to plan and figure out how things are going to work in counterintuitive ways. That's important for the kind of work that we're doing here. How about the duality of normal versus weird? That trips a lot of people up. I know personally had a huge influence in my life because we go to school, right? And in school, we're in school for 12 years, basically. And then we go to college too, most of us. Um, and through peer pressure and various kinds of cultural norms, people pick on us, they laugh at us for being weird. And we're taught that being weird is wrong or bad. And so we're taught that we have to be normal and we have to fit in. So we have to check ourselves when we're going out. We check ourselves in the mirror. Are we normal? Do I look normal? Or am I weird? Am I being weird? Is it weird if I say this? Is it weird if I act this way? Is it weird if I ask this person for something? And then it gets to the point where we really start to feel like, well, oh, that thing is really weird. And then we laugh at other people. See, we participate in all this ourselves. So we see some kid who dresses funny, and oh, look at that weird kid. Let's laugh at him. Let's pick on him. See, we do this, and in our mind, as we do this, as we bully others and others bully us, we reinforce this notion of what's normal and what's weird. But of course, all of this is totally relative. You go to a different school, you go to a different country, you go to a different time, take a time machine, go back 1,000 years. Normal and weird are going to be totally opposite. So then why do you take them so seriously? Why do you invest so much emotional energy into being normal? Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you're sort of the contrarian and you actually have taken on the identity of being the weird one. And so now you act it up. And so like you dress weird on purpose. You act weird on purpose. You get weird tattoos and facial piercings on purpose to kind of freak people out because you've got a sort of an anti-authoritarian streak in you. But see, you're playing a role. That role is now defining your whole life. You're a prisoner to that. You're a prisoner either to being normal or you're a prisoner to being weird. And as you're engaged in this tug of war, you're not able to be authentic. And authenticity would be sort of the absolute or the transcendent in this case. It would be authenticity with a capital A, which transcends normality and weirdness. How about black versus white, racially speaking? African versus European. Millions of people are hung up on this as though it's important, as though it matters, as though these categories are somehow given to us by God, given us to us by nature, given us to us by genetics. But you know what? Many good biologists and serious scientists, when they actually look into the data, they look into genetics. It's actually very difficult genetically to distinguish many Europeans from Africans. A lot of Europeans have DNA that's closer to an African than two Africans have to each other, if you select the right Europeans and the right Africans. See? So a lot of these categories that we've constructed culturally just don't pass muster. They don't pass muster scientifically in many cases, but even deeper than that, they don't pass muster. Even if they did pass muster scientifically, even if you showed me all the genetic data that said that, well, there's a very clear difference between Africans and Europeans, or males and females. You know, all males have a Y chromosome and all females have two X chromosomes, you might say. That means nothing. That's only the scientific level. You got to go deeper to the existential level, because what is a chromosome? And why do you hold it as being important at all? See, a chromosome itself is a distinction. X versus Y chromosomes, that's a distinction. Who created that distinction? You did, of course. Who's giving that distinction importance? You are, of course. See? Where in the universe does it say that there should be importance given to an X or to a Y chromosome? Nowhere. We made it up. Why do we make it up? Because it's convenient for our survival. And to realize that we made it up gives us the freedom to change it, to let go of it. Because you know what? A lot of times we make up shit that we think is going to help our survival, but actually it hurts our survival. Or it used to help our survival, but now it doesn't. Now it's become counterproductive because we've evolved beyond that. You know, when we were living in the savannas, in the forests and jungles thousands of years ago, there was a much greater significance between males and females and those gender roles than there is in 21st century Western democratic society. Because most jobs today don't involve heavy manual labor, which was that distinguishing important factor between men and women. And most people today, they're not engaged in warfare, tribal warfare. And most women can do most of the jobs that men can do, and vice versa. See? But if we get stuck on our old paradigms and dualities and categories, that holds us back. And then we get silly notions thinking like, well, but women aren't as good engineers as men are. We create these sort of very simplistic black and white generalizations. And then that can harm people too. It keeps us from interfacing more accurately and directly with reality. Because really what we're doing is we're filtering reality through our categories. And that radically changes how we conceive of reality, and then how we relate to reality, and then what we do with reality. And that's your whole life right there. See, so if you really want to change your whole life, start changing and questioning these dualistic categories that you always take for granted as just a given, as absolutes. They're not absolutes. Being black or white is not an absolute. There are people who are half and half. What do you call a person who's 50% black and 50% white? 50% African, 50% European. Are they black or are they white? A lot of whites would call them black. Isn't that interesting? Very biased way to look at it. And even many black people would call that person black, precisely because they know that even if you have a little bit of black in you, you're going to be treated like you're black, because that was the way that Europeans acted towards Africans for a long time. And that's still a trend. It's deeply ingrained in our culture. Very interesting. Isn't it interesting when you have a person who's 50% African and 50% European? He's going to be considered African, not European, by most people, by our culture. Very interesting. And then, of course, look, we create entire identities. You know, people spend 50 years living this identity of being African or being European. They get wrapped up in it, whether they're reacting against it or whether they're embracing it. It doesn't matter. You could be some white nationalist thing that Europeans are the best, or you could be an African American spending your whole life building an identity fighting that. But in either case, you're trapped in it. You're in this tug of war. How do you transcend it? Well, of course, you have to transcend race. Even transcend the notion that you're a human being, that you're an animal, that you're even a creature. All of this can be transcended if you access the absolute, but it takes some work. And you can't do that work so long as you're clinging to your African identity or your European identity or your human identity. What you need to discover is your absolute identity. And that's what awakening is. That's what non-duality is. See, when you fully awaken, what you'll realize is that you're African, you're European, you're Chinese, you're Asian, you're Eskimo, you're Japanese, you're all animals, you're a dog, you're a cat, you're an elephant, you're a fly, you're a mosquito, you're a space alien floating around on some planet in some other galaxy. All of it is you. No boundaries, no dualities, no categories. See, that's the power of questioning these categories. These categories are not just a conceptual thing, you have to understand. And we'll talk about this when we get into part 2, but just to give you a little preview here, these categories go to the very bone of reality, such that reality itself like I said before, is a category. Your body. You think your body is a physical body? Says who? Says you. And what are you? You think you're what? Whatever you think you are, that's a category you're creating. You is a category. Body is a category. You're creating these. But you're not taking them as something you create. You're taking them as a given, as reality. So what you have is you have this nested web of belief, which has been built up, this sort of operating system that's running your entire mind and your entire life, which is sort of categories nested within other categories, going all the way down more and more and more fundamental. And then there's a few super fundamental categories at the very bottom, at the rock bottom, that solidify your entire life, such that if these categories were seriously questioned and unraveled, your entire life would dissolve. The notion of you having a body would disappear. You see, most people aren't open to this possibility. But you are going to be practicing radical open-mindedness, so you should be open to it. Okay, next, moving on. Next duality, flawed versus perfect. We tend to treat these as real. Like, that's a perfect diamond, and therefore it's worth millions of dollars. Or, no, that's a flawed diamond, it's only worth $100. And you might determine how much your husband loves you by the size and quality and perfection of the diamond he gives you. And of course, your husband will be judging you based on the perfection of your beauty. So he will judge your body and your face and your butt and your boobs and everything about you and your personality and rank you on a scale of 1 to 10. And depending on where he ranks you, he'll give you a bigger diamond. You see. And while all of this nonsense is going on, what will be missed is perfection as an absolute, perfection with a capital P. You can become conscious that everything is perfect all the time. There's no such thing as imperfection. Imperfection is a relative thing. Wouldn't that be an interesting way to look at the world, to see it as perfect all the time, no matter what is going on? That's a powerful shift in perception if you can accomplish that. Straight versus curved. Dark versus light. Dirty versus clean. This one is interesting. So notice the following. If you take a piece of dog shit on the sidewalk, is it dirty or is it clean? Of course, everyone would say it's dirty. Well, not to a fly. To a fly, that's a beautiful sight. To a fly, it's very clean. The fly will actually lay its eggs in the dog shit, feast off the dog shit. So first of all, notice that. Secondly, though, also notice if we take a microscope and we zoom into that dog shit. Let's say we zoom into it to the molecular level and we take one molecule, like a carbon atom within the dog shit. Is the carbon atom dirty or clean? See, you can't apply the category of dirty and clean to a carbon atom because that category has been created relative to us humans. It's not an absolute. It's not like in the universe somewhere there's a database that says that dog shit is dirty. No. We created that distinction. What we mean when we humans say that something is dirty is we mean that it's got a certain relationship to our survival function. So for example, we wouldn't want to wash our hands in dog shit because we can get a disease and then we could die from that. And so in that sense, we call it dirty. But that doesn't mean it actually is dirty. All it really means is that this is something that might harm my survival. Okay, that might be true. I don't recommend that you go washing your hands in dog shit. But see, the problem is that some people get it in their mind that some things actually are dirty, like sex is dirty. The Catholics will guilt you into believing that sex is dirty, and then every time you have sex, you're going to feel dirty. Then you're going to go run, take a shower to wash yourself. And you might say, well, Leo, but that's good because, I don't want to get some STD or something. Yeah, but you can never enjoy sex now ever in your life because you always think it's dirty. See, you're reacting against it. You're not doing it consciously. If you really want to take a shower, go take a shower. There's no problem taking a shower after sex if you feel you need to. The problem is that you do it compulsively and you feel guilty about it and you suffer for it. Wild versus tame. At what point does an animal become tame? Humans tamed cats and dogs and cattle and so forth. I was watching an interesting documentary recently. Was it Vice? Maybe Vice or Vox. I don't know what I was watching. Some YouTube video. And they were talking about how some Russian scientist, Soviet scientists in like the 1950s or 60s developed a program for breeding foxes. And it was thought that you can't tame a fox. Did you know that some animals are actually tameable, whereas others are not? For example, you can't tame a rhinoceros, or so conventional wisdom says. And in fact, one of the reasons that European civilization developed faster than all other civilizations, for example, Africa and other places like South America, one of the reasons is because Europeans were fortunate enough that they had, when they were, still in their caveman days before civilization, is they had an abundance of tameable animals, which is purely a coincidence. It's a geographic and sort of coincidental factor. Europeans had access to horses and cattle and sheep and goats and all sorts of animals that could be tamed relatively easily. You go to Africa and see a lot of white nationalists, they'll make this argument and they'll say, well, but Europeans, we're the most advanced race. We're the smartest. We have the highest IQs. Don't kid yourself. Don't kid yourself. You know how hard survival is in Africa? You know how many diseases they have there? Of course, that's because of the geography. Because it's much warmer, wetter, more humid. There's a jungle there. It's so much harder to survive in Africa, in the wild, than in Europe. And they have a lot fewer tameable animals. Go try to tame a giraffe. Go try to tame an elephant. Go try to tame a rhinoceros or a lion or a tiger. Can't do it in most cases. You can tame elephants, but most of those other animals, like, you're not going to be able to tame them because their physiology and their genetics and their psychology actually determines whether they're tameable or not. So what this Russian scientist did in the Soviet era is he was trying to tame foxes. And so he was selectively breeding foxes in order to breed ones that had the kindest dispositions to human beings, the ones that would bite the least and so forth. And eventually he was able to succeed to the point where now there's a semi-tamed version. So it's not fully tamed, it's like half tamed. It's still half wild, half tamed, but you can actually keep it as a pet. So if you're wondering why aren't, we have cats and dogs as pets, but we don't have foxes as pets. Well, because foxes were difficult to tame. And, it took thousands of years, all the way till the 1960s, for someone to tame these foxes. And even still, they're not totally tame. They can still bite you. And you can buy these foxes. They're very rare. They're very expensive. They cost like tens of thousands of dollars, but you can buy these semi-tame foxes. Very interesting. See? So that just shows you how much bleed through there is between these categories. It's not so simple as just saying, well, that animal's a wild animal, that animal's a tame animal, right? But at some point, you got to figure that for an animal to become tame, it had to go through a process of becoming more and more and more tame. So there were degrees of tameness. It's not a binary wild or tame. Next, simple versus complex. This is relative. Wet versus dry, common versus rare. Pros versus cons, upsides versus downsides. Fair versus unfair. A lot of people complain about the unfairness of life, how unfair things are. But that's only because they haven't transcended this dualistic notion of fair versus unfair to get to the absolute, which is fairness with a capital F. So when you realize that you, as universal consciousness, will live through every single incarnation and lifetime of every human being and every animal in the entire universe that has ever occurred and ever will occur, which I talked about in my episode called The Radical Implications of Oneness. So when you truly realize that there's only one being in the entire universe that's going to live through all of itself, all of the permutations, when you realize that, you'll also realize that the universe is perfectly fair. Fair with a capital F. What that means is that in one lifetime, for example, you will get robbed. And that will be unfair for you in that lifetime. But simultaneously, you're also living as the person who robbed you. You see? So that person who robbed you, they get to enjoy the money they stole from you. So that's the fairness paid back. But who's it paid back to? You think it's paid back to them. No, it's paid back to you because you're going to be the one who gets robbed from and the one who robs and then enjoys that money. See? So you're going to experience both sides of every equation in life, of every situation. So whatever you think is unfair now, you'll experience the opposite of it. You'll experience everything. And by doing that, it will be one complete, fair perfection. But of course, that takes a radical degree of awakening to realize. How about winning versus losing, gain versus loss? Have you noticed how relative this is? People get hung up on being a winner or being a loser. They build their entire identity around this. Look at our president. He's obsessed with being a winner and not being a loser, like it's driving his whole damn life. Look at what it's making him do. It's driving him crazy. He actually thinks that there are winners and losers in life. Success versus failure. A lot of people get hung up trying to be successful in life and not being a failure because their father didn't give them enough love. So they need to prove something to themselves and to their father or to whatever notion they have. See, without realizing that, of course, success is all relative. What is success? Is earning $100 million, is that success? Or is becoming awakened and raising your capacity to love, or is that success? Or having a successful marriage with beautiful children, is that success? What is success? Is there even such a thing as failure? People become very depressed by believing that they've failed in life, or they failed in their career, or they failed as an artist, or they failed as a husband, or as a wife, or as a son or a daughter. See? So this is not just philosophy. This is very practical stuff here we're talking about. Fake versus genuine. What happens when you make a fake that is so good that you can't distinguish it from something genuine? Does it stop being fake at that point? Fiction versus nonfiction. A lot of times, fiction has more truth in it than nonfiction. Have you noticed that? Good fiction always has a lot of truth in it, and a lot of nonfiction doesn't, or it has shallow truths. Cowardice versus bravery. These seem like opposites. But are they really? Most people who do brave stuff, they do it despite the fear they have. The line between some act of bravery and cowardice is very, very thin, a lot thinner than most people think. A lot of people get in their mind that, well, that person, he's brave. He's a brave person, and that person's a coward. Well, of course, sometimes it's very clear like that. Some people are very fearful and therefore cowardly. But a lot of what we would call brave people that we idolize, really, they're just like a hair's width away from having been a coward. The difference is very small. And a lot of people could be brave about one thing, but then cowardly in some other thing. So it's not like you're brave across the board in all situations. There are certain areas in life where you'll find it easy to be brave, and other areas in life where you'll find it very difficult to be brave. You'll be a coward in those areas. Those will be like your weak spots. But see, what if someone gets it in their mind that, oh, I'm a coward, and they keep telling themselves that story all the time, and they start to believe in it. They build an identity out of being a coward based on a couple of cherry-picked, situations from their life. How about slave versus master? You can't have a slave without a master, and you can't have a master without a slave. In a certain sense, and this is sort of the whole idea of things going full circle, a master, a slave master, is enslaved by owning slaves. He's enslaved to that paradigm. See? He's enslaved to being a slave master. Now, of course, being a slave master is better than being a slave, but you're still not free as a slave master. See? How about superficial versus profound? This is very relative. Abstract versus concrete, general versus specific, growth versus decay. Growth and decay always follow one another. People keep chasing never-ending growth, never-ending profits, never-ending excitement, never-ending happiness, never-ending personal growth. It doesn't happen. Whatever goes up must come down, as the saying goes. How about agitated versus calm? You can transcend this duality to an absolute calm. Calm with a capital C, by awakening. How about arrogance versus humility? A lot of times, the most humble people are the ones who were extremely arrogant earlier in their life. So really what happened is that their humility is not in opposition to their arrogance. It's actually the consequence. The culmination of arrogance is humility. Because you act very arrogantly, especially when you're young, in your 20s and 30s, and then you become wiser. You discover deeper truths, and you self-reflect, and you see your arrogance with the arrogance with which you behaved, and you get humbled by your own arrogance. It becomes disgusting to you. You can't stand it anymore, and then you become humble. You get sick of your own arrogance. How about the duality of violence versus peace, war versus peace? A lot of people get hung up on this, and a lot of liberals and progressives get hung up on this, because liberals tend to get this idea that, well, peace is good, violence is bad, war is bad, all war is bad, all war is wrong, there shouldn't be war. Speaking of shouldn't be war, there shouldn't be any war, without realizing that actually it's only possible to have peace through violence and through war. So you can transcend this duality, and you can realize that there is only peace as an absolute, peace with a capital P. And what that means is that even when war is going on, you're conscious enough to realize that that war and that violence is actually leading to an ultimate greater peace. That's part of the whole long-term design of the universe, is that every act is ultimately leading towards greater good and greater peace, greater love, greater unity, greater consciousness. See, but most people are too stuck in the tug of war to realize the function of war and violence. They just want it to end. But what they're doing in that situation is they're mistaking peace with a lowercase p for peace with an uppercase P. You can't just have total peace without any war or violence. Can't have that. There's a reason why war happens and violence happens. Because it should happen. You need to surrender your notion that it shouldn't happen. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take actions to limit war and violence. So I'm not saying, go nuts and start bombing everyone. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that if bombing happens, when it does happen, since it is happening, and therefore it should be happening. And you need to realize that. You need to realize what is the role that bombing is playing in the larger scheme of everything. That's something that many liberals and progressives just can't stomach that. It's beyond them because they're stuck on this relative duality. Personal versus impersonal. Is the universe personal or impersonal? It's so both. It's so much both. It's so impersonal, and yet it's also so deeply personal. That's what makes it so interesting. That's the paradox of it. You'll discover that when you awaken. Innocent versus guilty. Well, this is a hornet's nest. People start arguing about where guilt and blame should go and who's really innocent. That becomes a dualistic trap. Past versus future. Have you noticed that the past or that the future always becomes the past, and the past has always been a future at some point until it happened and then it became the past? Confused versus clear. Capitalism versus socialism versus communism. Oh man, people are getting so confused about these labels, these political labels, or for that matter, conservative versus liberal. This duality, it's a totally relative duality. What does it really mean to be conservative or liberal? I mean, people who were liberals 50 years ago are now conservatives. Legal versus illegal. This, of course, is all relative. Countries have very different legal systems. We make them up out of thin air. Criminal versus non-criminal. Criminal versus police. Terrorist versus non-terrorist. These are all very tricky dichotomies. Criminal versus police. When you create this dichotomy, it makes it seem as though the police can never be criminal. But we have to realize that the police can also be criminals. So, in many third world countries, the police are more criminal than the criminals are, that they're supposed to be policing. So that's exactly what that yin-yang symbol is showing you. In the white, there's a dot of black, and you gotta be mindful of that. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to be running the police department, not realizing that there's a giant cancer of corruption growing in your police department. Terrorists versus non-terrorists. People get this idea that it's very easy to classify what a terrorist is. But, as we discovered after the Iraq War and with all the fiasco with the Guantanamo Bay and imprisoning and extraordinary rendition, all this kind of shady stuff that the U.S. was doing, all these enemy combatants that were classified as terrorists so they could be tortured and interrogated in cruel ways. A lot of them, it turns out, years later, we see the reports leaking. A lot of them, were not even close to terrorists. They were just random guys that were picked up in Iraq or somewhere else, that were mistaken for a terrorist, just like an innocent mistake. And he was just like a guy walking down the street, and then he gets into some, Guantanamo prison, gets tortured. He has no information to give you. But he's just classified as a terrorist. He gets no due process, doesn't see a judge for decades, can't defend himself. Think about it. It's a horrific situation. But a lot of people, they just say, well, the government called him a terrorist, so he must be a terrorist. And then what qualifies as a terrorist? You got to be a Muslim to be a terrorist? Does a white guy shooting up a school or a church, does that count as a terrorist? Many white guys think, no, terrorists must be Muslims. See? So this notion of terrorism gets linked with nationalism. These categories become very, very black and white, very overly generalized, and lead to all sorts of delusions and bad policy. Hero versus villain. You know, my favorite movies is where the hero and the villain aren't very clear. Fucks with your mind. Because it's very easy to write a story or a movie where you have just a clear hero, clear villain, but that's not how it works in real life. In real life, you've got that white, but it's got a spot of black, and you've got that black, but it's got a spot of white. So if you really want to write a good story, as a writer, you got to really understand this psychological stuff. You know, if you watch Actualized.org for 5 years and you learn everything I talk about and you do the practices and you're a writer, you want to write stories, you're gonna be a fucking genius at writing stories, because you're gonna know all the emotional buttons to push, and you're gonna be able to write characters that are just like so psychologically true. So psychologically true, because you're gonna, for example, understand that you need to give your villain some redeeming, loving qualities. You need to show how your villain, when your villain is doing evil in whatever story you're writing, write it in such a way such that the audience realizes that the evil he's doing is actually being done out of love from his perspective. That's how you write a good villain. And then with the hero, you got to give him some weaknesses. He can't be a superhero. He can't be too strong. He has to have legitimate weaknesses and aspects of darkness that pull him away from his heroism into villainy. That's how you write a realistic and emotionally resonant hero. And then when you get them fighting with each other or conflicting with each other, that you get this interesting interplay. That's how a great story is made. So you got to really understand human psychology to write good story. In fact, one of the reasons I got into studying human psychology is because I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write science fiction when I was younger, and I was really interested in, like, how do I make a good villain? And I didn't want just to make, he's just evil. Like, I really wanted my villain to be relatable, and I wanted the audience to have empathy for the villain. In fact, I wanted the villain to end up being like the main part, the shining part of the whole story, not the hero. So that's a little tangent for you. Journey versus destination. A lot of people chase destinations without realizing that the journey and the destination are one and the same. Ruler versus ruled. Ugly versus beautiful. That, of course, could be transcended to beauty with a capital B, where you see everything as beauty. There's no such thing as ugliness. There's only beauty when you get to the absolute. Art versus non-art. Discord versus harmony. Masturbation versus sex. This one's funny. People get hung up about masturbating and FAP, no FAP, and all this. But when you become truly conscious, what you realize, when you realize non-duality, when you realize oneness, is actually you realize that all of this is just God's masturbatorium. God is just masturbating. That's all God is doing, because God is one. So there's nobody else here but you. You are God. So anyone you're having sex with is you masturbating. So what you're doing is you're using their body to masturbate. There's no difference between masturbation and sex. Not really. Not if you take a high enough perspective on it. Student versus teacher. Well, the best teachers are usually great students. And also, if you want to learn a lot, if you want to be a really good student, try being a teacher. Teaching is one of the best ways to study. Child versus parent, or child versus adult. We create these categories, but you know what? A lot of adults are more immature than some children. And of course, every adult is itself a child. Name me one adult who is not a child at the same time. Every adult was a child and still is a child to some other adult. which is why your mom still treats you as a child even when you're grown up, because she still sees you as a child. From her perspective, it's all relative. And then, of course, children become parents. Children have other children. Just shows you how interesting the interplay is. It's really profound when you start to contemplate this. And I recommend that you contemplate all these dualities for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Really think about it. There's a lot here. There's a reason I made this long list. Healthy versus unhealthy. Product development versus marketing. Product development, not personal development. So what I mean by this is, in certain companies, they will separate the product development department from the marketing department. So like the product, we're making some phone, some gadget, some iPod or whatever. Okay, so we're making this iPod. That's done in the product development department. The engineers do that. And then we have the marketing department who's creating the marketing campaign for the iPod. And they don't communicate with each other. They're separated in two different buildings around the world. They don't talk to each other. And then you got a terrible product and marketing campaign, both. To have a really successful product launch, you need to integrate from the very beginning the product development with the marketing. A lot of newbie business people, they spend all their time on product development, zero time on marketing. And then they develop a product. The product might be great, but then the marketing sucks, so the product never actually gains traction. Nobody knows about it. Nobody buys it. It goes out of business because you didn't pay attention to how the product would be marketed. You got to design your product in such a way that it will market itself. That takes work. So the best product developers are often the best marketers, you see. Oftentimes, by studying marketing, you can learn what kind of product you should be developing. Like, what kind of features do people want? What kind of features are actually marketable? And then sometimes you have the opposite problem, which is where marketing dictates to the product development people what they should be developing. And so then what you get is a sort of a very markety, cheap, salesy type of product, which is trying to appeal to everybody. And it doesn't really have a heart or a soul that a great inventor or designer or engineer or artist would have put into developing that product. So there has to be a delicate balance between those two if you want to get it right. A lot of times, notice within academia and universities, they create different majors, different sub-schools, different departments. Like you've got the engineering department, which is separate from the computer science department, separate from the biology department, separate from the humanities, separate from the arts. They're all in different buildings. They don't talk to each other. They criticize and look down upon each other. So these are all artificial dualities. There's no real separation between the humanities and the sciences and the arts. This is a fiction. There's no real separation between biology and chemistry. This is a fiction. And this creates bad science. Because most of the interesting science, especially nowadays, is happening at the intersection point between the hard sciences and the soft sciences, and the arts and the sciences, and mathematics and physics and chemistry. Like, it's all in between, in the cracks, is where you find the really juicy stuff. How about uncivilized versus civilized? Well, that's very relative. Europeans have considered most other nations around the world and peoples around the world very uncivilized. And yet you go to the Amazon, you discover some tribe in the Amazon that doesn't barely wear any clothes. And yet they have very sophisticated spiritual wisdom, teachings, traditions that are more sophisticated. For example, in the Amazon, you'll find very sophisticated spiritual, psychological development through the use of ayahuasca, for example. Stuff that in America, in the West, Western psychologists and psychotherapists can't even comprehend the degree of wisdom that might be present in some shaman who's doing ayahuasca. And yet they consider the shaman to be the uncivilized one. How funny is that? How about spirituality versus politics, or church versus state? You could make the argument that it's important to separate church versus, church from state. That is true. That was an important development within our politics. But at the same time, you also can't separate spirituality from politics. When your politics is divorced completely from all spirituality, what you get is a sort of technocracy and a sort of corporatist evil. Just materialism run amok. So actually, you do need spirituality to inform politics, just in the right way. Not as an organized religion per se, but you do need spiritual wisdom within politics, or it's going to be really bad. And in fact, in the future, we're going to see a trend where more and more politicians are more open about their spirituality, not about their religion, but about their spirituality and how that shapes their vision, their goals, their values, and their leadership ability. In fact, some of the best political leaders were deeply spiritual practitioners, like Gandhi would be a great example of that. And we're going to see more of that in the future. It's really difficult to get that balance right, because politics tends to be very dirty. But at the same time, it's precisely because politics is so dirty that it's so deeply in need of consciousness and spiritual wisdom and spiritual leaders. Yet at the same time, when you combine spirituality and politics, you get a really nasty combination such that the politics can end up dragging the spirituality into the mud. So you got to be very firmly rooted in your spirituality. It has to be very genuine and authentic in order for you then to be also a good political leader. Very few people can pull that off, and that's because they're not practicing spirituality on a deep enough level. It's just mostly dogma and beliefs. That's not going to cut it. So if we're talking about dogma and beliefs and organized religion, then yes, it's very important to have a separation of church and state. Important versus unimportant. That's very relative. Significant versus insignificant. Mother versus father. What if you are raised by two fathers, two gay men, a gay couple? They adopt you and they raise you. Do you think that's going to affect your understanding of the word mother and father? That category, for you, you will have a different sense of that category than traditionally raised people. How about democracy versus tyranny? It might seem that these are two totally opposite things, but not necessarily. A lot of tyranny can come out of democracy. Hitler was democratically elected. See? A lot of times, unconscious ethnocentric people will elect a highly ethnocentric authoritarian leader who then becomes a tyrant, but he's elected democratically. And then even in a democracy, you can still have a sort of tyranny of the masses, where the majority can oppress the minority, which is why protecting minority rights is so important. Sober versus intoxicated. This one's very interesting because sometimes people say, well, Leo, did you have a real awakening, or was it a psychedelic trip that you did? And I look at that and I say, well, what's the difference? What's the difference? You're making this category of being conscious without a psychedelic or with a psychedelic, whether you're intoxicated or not. You're still having some kind of awakening. Now, of course, there are important differences. I'm not saying that they're indistinguishable, but I'm just saying that the boundary is not so easily set as you think. It's possible to have a deeper awakening intoxicated than sober. See, most people don't think that way. Most people think very simplistically, like, well, if it's intoxicated, then it can't be a real enlightenment. It can't be real wisdom. It can't be real insight. It can't be real truth. Man, I've accessed deeper truths than you will ever access sober while I was intoxicated. So just keep that in mind. And not just me, many, many other people. You got to be intoxicated in the right way. See? Beginning versus end. Have you noticed that every end is some new beginning? And every beginning has an end? Need versus want. That's very tricky. These change so much, your needs and your wants. What you need, what you feel you need. A billionaire might feel like he needs a yacht, and you might say, well, he doesn't really need it. Well, to him, it seems like he needs it. And as long as it feels that way to him, it'll be a need, not just a want. Most of the stuff in life that you need, you don't actually need, you want it. Then again, you need to satisfy your wants. It's sort of programmed into you. Do you need to live or do you want to live? Think about that. Is there a need for you to be alive, or is it something you want? There's no need. So in that sense, what do you need at all? You might say, well, you need water and air. Well, only if you need to be alive, but you don't need to be alive. So if you want to be alive, then you want water and you want air. See how we can play with these? It's very fluid. Pain versus pleasure. People hold these as opposites when really they're not. It's actually possible to enjoy pain. And pleasure can get so pleasureful and so much, too cloying to the point where it gets nauseating. Too much pleasure. And it's possible to transcend living your life between these poles of chasing pleasure and avoiding pain. Because that tug of war never ends. You're always stuck, bouncing back and forth, yo-yoing between those two. And that in itself becomes painful and then becomes quite frustrating. So it's possible to transcend that, such that you're in sort of a state of joy, which transcends both pleasure and pain. Individual versus group, or individualism versus collectivism. I see people talking about this in the political context, as if like individualism is good and collectivism is bad, or vice versa. No, there needs to be a very delicate balance between these two. You can't have a society that totally values individualism and no collectivism, or vice versa. It's very important to strike a delicate balance between those two. Because actually, the importance of collectivism is that when you get the collectivism right, when you get the right collective, it actually empowers individualism. That's what people don't understand, who are arch individualists. That's what a lot of like libertarians and conservatives don't understand about socialism, for example. If we get socialism done right, it'll actually enable individualism. Because right now, under the current system in America, for example, your individualism is crippled by the economic conditions under which you're in. So the capitalist system actually makes it less possible for the majority of people to be individuals and to be free. That's the paradox and irony of it. But of course, if the collectivism becomes too much, then you get the sort of Borg collective scenario where it's sort of like, I guess, a little bit like communist China, where, you know, the government is censoring everything and dictating everything you do, you know, implanting chips into children so that they can monitor them, this sorts of stuff that's happening in China. And, you know, that is problematic. That does actually hurt individualism. So there's an important role for both of these forces. And really what you do is, through non-duality and spirituality, you transcend them both, and you realize how important both of them are. You need to allow people to be individuals, but at the same time, individuals also need to recognize that they must sacrifice for the collective good, for society. It's not just about you, the way that libertarians like to think, like, well, if I just get what I want, and I'm left alone and I'm doing good, then that's all that like matters. And that any sort of collectivism, well, that's infringing on my rights. Taxation, that's infringing on my rights to keep all of my income. You're taking my income at the point of a gun. But you live in a society, dude. You live in a fucking society. You're a tribal ape creature. And the only reason you're alive and that you were even born is because you're part of this collective, whether you like it or not. The problem is that libertarians don't accept that they're in a collective. They don't fathom this. And that being in a collective means certain sacrifices have to be made. You don't just get individualism to the hilt. Primary versus secondary is a duality. Thought, feeling, emotion. We already talked about that a bit. Inclusion versus exclusion. Theist versus atheist. This one, I've talked about this one at length in the past, so I'll just briefly touch on it. Most theists and atheists think that the spectrum just has two ends to it, and that's it. They don't recognize there's sort of a meta level and meta levels that incorporates both, and you can transcend both theism and atheism. They're really not opposites at all. Most theists and atheists have a lot in common, a lot more than they're willing to admit. And they both have a lot of delusions that they're not willing to admit. Consistent versus inconsistent. Moderate versus extreme. What is extreme? Extreme is completely relative. Attraction versus repulsion. These are defined in terms of each other. Contraction versus expansion. Dominant versus submissive. You need both for that relationship to work. Gross versus subtle. Popular versus unpopular. Mainstream versus niche. What's mainstream today used to be niche 10 years ago, and vice versa. Status quo versus change. Again, in politics, people love to get hung up on this. They either defend the status quo or they want change, without realizing the importance that both forces play. It's important to preserve the status quo in a certain way, and it's important also to get healthy change. It's possible to get dysfunctional and unhealthy status quo and also dysfunctional and unhealthy change. So it's not enough to just say that you're for change. What kind of change are you talking about? And it's not enough just to denounce the status quo, because you got to recognize all the foundation that the status quo gives you that you wouldn't otherwise have, all the luxuries and freedoms you have given the status quo, given the infrastructure built by society. You got to respect that to a certain degree. Incremental change versus revolutionary change. People argue about this. Should we change government a little bit or a lot? And then the revolutionaries, they criticize the incrementalists because the incrementalists are viewed as just being too lukewarm, too moderate. And the revolutionaries, they don't realize the importance of incremental change. You can't just revolutionize everything. It's going to be unstable and it's going to collapse. But also, they're right in a certain sense, because the moderates and the incrementalists, they're a little too conservative. And in certain times, you need revolutionary change. You need a big change sometimes in your life or in your government in order to move up to the next level. So how do you find that balance? Well, it's tricky. It's not black and white. Stable versus unstable. Temporary versus eternal. This is one of those absolutes. You can transcend this to eternal with a capital E, where you realize that everything is eternal. It exists outside of time. This very moment exists outside of time. It's an absolute. Addition versus subtraction. For example, isn't it interesting how you can add a negative number to a positive number? Or you can subtract two negative numbers, and then that gives you a positive number. It's kind of weird how the rules of that work when you start to work with double negatives. mixing and matching positives and negatives in your addition, and then you learn those rules in elementary school. So it's sort of like you're adding and subtracting positives and negatives, and it can work in counterintuitive ways, where like negatives can add up into a positive. How about work versus play? Do you think of your work as separate from your play, or is your work your play? See? What determines whether something is work versus play? Have you noticed sometimes you're playing a game, it's a fun game, but then you start to grind on that game, and now it feels like work. And then sometimes you're working, but it's like you're so engrossed in it, you're so excited by it, and you're so passionate about it, like you're following your life purpose, let's say, and now it starts to feel like you're playing and you're not working. Like if you're maybe doing music, you're playing with music, or you're playing with paint on the canvas if you're an artist, or you're playing with words if you're a writer, and then your work becomes play. How do you turn work into play? And how do you prevent play from becoming work? Not so easy. Content versus context. This one's tricky. A lot of content becomes the context for yet more content. Context is usually itself content of some kind. So it's sort of like content is nested within context, but then you can have multiple nestings, multiple contexts within each other, multiple sets of content. Closed versus open. Local versus global. Minimum versus maximum. Buyer versus seller. Lender versus borrower. Entrance versus exit. Every entrance is an exit. Unless, of course, it's a one-way door, and then it only is an exit or an entrance. Like versus dislike. Ignorance versus wisdom. Emotional versus rational. This is a really tricky duality that people get stuck on. They either think of themselves as being emotional or rational. They side with one or the other without realizing that the two interplay with each other. A lot of rational people don't realize that their rationality itself is underpinned by emotional needs and attitudes, and that all their logic and reason is actually infested and motivated by unconscious emotions, which will be a rude awakening for them to discover, because it'll burst that entire rationalist bubble that they're operating under. Usually these are stage orange people. Functional versus dysfunctional. Very relative. Employee versus employer. Sexual versus non-sexual. What makes a thing sexual? It's kind of a gray area. You know, people have weird sexual fetishes. Are feet sexual or non-sexual? For some people, they're sexual. Leader versus follower. You can't have a leader without followers. You can't have a follower without leader. Victim versus abuser. Usually these two, as they say, it takes two to tango. Usually these two kind of work in tandem with each other. If you get victimized a lot, it's because you're playing a victim a lot. And then you're playing into this role of victim abuser. And likewise, if you're an abuser, then you tend to seek out victims to relate to, creating these dysfunctional relationships. And a lot of times the victim, him or herself, is an abuser also in a different way, in a different scenario. So while they're complaining about being a victim, they themselves are abusing somebody else. Predator, prey, friend versus enemy, us versus them, people versus corporations. This is an interesting one, especially in the context of politics. We tend to talk about, the corporations are the evil ones. And of course, corporations do a lot of evil, selfish stuff that benefits only them. But then again, don't treat corporations as though they're separate from people. Who creates these corporations? Who runs these corporations? A corporation is made out of its people. So to really understand the politics of corporations, you have to really understand that corporations are people, because they're made out of people, in a sense. And they have a similar psychology and dynamics to people because they're made out of people. Private versus public. It's another thorny duality for politics. Like, we tend to think of, like, there's the private realm and there's the public realm, and they're separate. But of course they're not separate. Your private life will bleed over into your public life, and your public life will bleed into your private life. How people think of you publicly will affect how you deal with your family and your children and your wife or your husband. And how you deal with your family, your children, your wife, and your husband will show up publicly, and people will judge you for that. A lot of people who are public celebrities and so forth, they try to kind of like live double lives. They have a public life and they have a private life, and they're separate. And they act differently publicly than they do privately. But then that becomes difficult to maintain. And yet at the same time, you also need to maintain some distance. You can't just, reveal your credit card number to everybody and show pictures of your naked children to people in public. You got to have some boundaries. So how do you strike this balance? Well, it's tricky. The whole point of life is that the devil is in the details. What life is reality sorting out all of this and working with these boundaries. You see, it's a dialectical dynamic activity of drawing these boundaries. So your mind is constantly doing it, but it's always happening in reality as well. Stuff like predator and prey, they're always fighting with each other, chasing and running away and doing that. And who's going to win? Well, you have to actually have kind of a clashing of opposites to see who wins the tug of war. You don't know ahead of time. Competition versus cooperation. This is an interesting duality. Oftentimes, you compete with those people that you cooperate with the most. For example, if you're working in some office, you've got 20 people on your team, and you guys are working together on some project, you're supposed to all be cooperating. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of competition within that cooperation, precisely because those people working with you are the ones who are going to be now considered for the next promotion. And there's only so many of those promotions. Not everyone's going to get one. So you're trying to cooperate and compete at the same time. That's tricky. How do you balance that? Safety versus danger. That's very tricky to balance as well. For example, with things like gun control, or even with controlling drugs and psychedelics. There's certain dangers with psychedelics. You can't just give it to everybody. That would be dangerous. Yet at the same time, you don't want to overemphasize the danger of psychedelics the way that it's been demonized in our culture, to the point where many people who suffer from PTSD, depression, anxiety, ADHD, and so forth, who would benefit enormously and could heal themselves through psychedelics, they can't, because people just naively think that they're dangerous, because the dangers are completely overblown. So it's not the case that psychedelics don't have any danger. They do. It's been overblown. Mediocre versus excellent. Implicit versus explicit. Culture versus cults. Very interesting what's considered a cult and what's considered mainstream culture. A lot of times that difference is very thin. As we see in our politics right now, a lot of our politics is dominated by cult psychology, cults of personality, which have become mainstream in a certain sense. Ordinary versus extraordinary. And of course, you can transcend that to experience the absolute, which is extraordinary with a capital E, when everything becomes extraordinary. Nothing is ordinary to you anymore. And lastly, serious versus playful. a lot of times comedians will actually use humor and be playful about the most serious things, precisely because that's where you need humor the most, is when something serious happens. It's sort of a psychological coping mechanism. Sometimes something is so serious, like have you ever experienced a trauma so bad, situation so bad, that you start to laugh? Because if you took it any more seriously, it would be tragic. It would be suicidal. And I'm going to end on two dualities here, which one serious one and one playful one. So the first one is the serious one, masculine versus feminine, or man versus woman. I touched on this already, but it really bears going into a little bit deeper, because we're seeing a trend now culturally, especially with young males, where they're sort of reacting against feminism, against femininity, and there's a sort of desire for hyper masculinity and macho-ness, this sort of red pill culture, this men going their own way, this MGTOW culture, pickup culture, gender norms are being questioned, homosexuality is becoming normalized, but yet people still resist it, especially more conservative parts of the country and the world still resist it, still deny it. And, common sense people say, Leo, what are you talking about? I mean, isn't it obvious? There's a man, there's a woman. You can clearly tell them apart. Is this really a category that the mind creates? I mean, is the mind really creating a dick with balls and a vagina? Is that what the mind is creating? Of course not. Of course, the mind is not actually creating the physical organs in that way that you think, that simplistic way. But what you're doing is you're creating these categories of man versus woman. And part of the reason that we're having this sort of backlash against social justice warriors is because they're blurring the boundary. Postmodernism is blurring the boundary between what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Homosexuality does that too, which is why there's homophobia. Because really homophobia, what that's about is it's about not accepting your own feminine side, trying to act macho when really you have some feminine side in you that you're denying and repressing and you're creating a shadow out of. So, is man and woman, is male and female, is this a mental construct? The answer is yes, it is. Gender, roles, are categories that you're constructing using your mind. Now, of course, it's not just you personally using your mind, it's your entire culture. And also all the ramifications and repercussions and significance that comes with this. And it has huge, enormous significance. And it's precisely because the significance is so large and is so practical and useful that you consider it so real when it's actually not real. So, first of all, you can have biological organs that people are born with, which is just a weird combination of stuff. It's not just your standard set of parts that a man and a woman has. It's some weird combination. So how do you classify those people? Are they men or are they women? What set of criteria are you going to use? Can you see how it's relative in that sense? So you can see in that edge case how those edge cases are precisely what breaks down the duality. And you should expect that such edge cases must exist. Because otherwise, you get this very simplistic notion of thinking like, well, only humans can be born with either one penis or with one vagina, and that's it. That's the only way they can be born. That's just not, medically, that's false. So you got to account for those edge cases. But even if we ignore those edge cases and we just look at anatomical men and anatomical women, let's say the men have X and Y chromosomes and the women just have the X chromosomes, and you're just going to adjudicate it that way. That's still a mental construction, because your notion of man and woman goes way, way, way beyond any kind of sense of chromosomes. In fact, what you're doing is you're using the notion of chromosomes and biology or physiology to backwards rationalize your concepts and categories of man and woman. You have very rich categories of man and woman with a lot of ancillary associations. So when I say man, you think of certain things and not other things. You think of beards, and you think of strength, and you think of, fast cars, and a lot of associations. And when you think of women, you think of a lot of other sorts of associations. So you got to understand that your category, this duality, it's not just as simple as like, oh, well, it's one thing or it's another thing. It's like, no, it brings with it so many assumptions, and it interconnects with the rest of your view of the world and who you are, your personal identity, right? This is all very deep, and it's all wired into your emotions as well. So it's not just like some dry thought of like, well, we're going to create a formula for identifying a man versus a woman. Yes, you can create a formula which will be maybe 98% accurate at identifying a man versus a woman. Like, you could train a computer to do that. A computer could take photographs of the below the waist of a man and a woman and be very accurate at identifying which is a man, which is a woman. But this tells you nothing about the fact that these are some sort of real or absolute categories that are mind independent. Because when we say man or woman, it's mostly all the associations you have with that matter, not your identity, your ability to identify one versus the other. And we're not saying here, don't make the mistake of thinking that what I'm saying here is that it's impossible to distinguish a man versus a woman, or it's impossible to distinguish, for example, safety versus danger, or it's impossible to distinguish a mediocre film from an excellent film. That's not what I'm saying. You can distinguish these things. Just recognize that you are the one who is doing the distinguishing, and also recognize what role does this play in how you then interact with life. What significance do you attach to the distinction? For example, I can easily distinguish most men from most women, as can some red pill MGTOW guy. But there's a very big difference between my understanding of men and women and my integration of masculine and feminine versus some MGTOW guy. Because the MGTOW guy will think of like, oh, woman, and then he'll have a bunch of associations. Women always cheat. They're sluts. They're whores. They're over-feminizing young men. They're destroying society. They're feminists. Feminism is wrong. I've got some emotions about that as this guy, this red pill guy. I've got some insecurities about that I'm hiding. I've got a shadow. I'm repressing. I've got various political views. There shouldn't be a woman president. There shouldn't be women in the military. And women are weak. They're the weaker sex. And I need women for sex. See, it's not all negative, of course. Your relationship is conflicted and fragmented as this red pill MGTOW guy. Because, see, on the one hand, you hate women and you demonize women and judge them. On the other hand, you still need them because you've got your sexual needs. So what are you doing? On the one hand, you're criticizing women. On the other hand, you're downloading porn and watching women and jerking off to them and getting your sexual needs met that way. You think that's not creating a problem in your mind there that you're going to have to reconcile later in your life? It is. It absolutely is. So with spiritual practice, as you become more conscious, what you're going to do is you're going to transcend and incorporate or integrate masculine and feminine, man and woman. You're going to stop identifying as a man or a woman, and you're going to realize that these are just two forces and that you're above and beyond that. You are the absolute, which includes everything. And just to finally nail this point home, one of my favorite video games is Morrowind. I love that game so much. And one of the pieces of lore within Morrowind, it's got a very rich and deep lore that I haven't even really studied much. But part of it that I do know is they have this character called Vivek. And if you're sort of a gamer nerd and you know Vivek, then you know Vivek is multicolored. He's divided in half. He's actually not a he, it's sort of like a he-she. It's a mixture of male and female, which is very interesting. And Vivek also in this in the lore there, he's supposed to be kind of awakened enlightened in this null state, which is very interesting. And so what it shows is that he's like a god, a deity who's incorporated the male and the female aspects into himself or into herself. That's a powerful image, but you know where they got that from? They didn't make it up. Of course, they got it from Hinduism. In Hinduism, they have a deity called, and this is a, a tongue twister of a name, Ardhanarishvara. Ardhanarishvara. And this deity is half male, half female, and it sort of represents the pinnacle of non-duality. When you become fully conscious of the absolute, you transcend the male and the female, unifying them both, not excluding either one, not blending them together into a muddled mess. So it's not like you become indistinct. The distinction is still there. It's just sort of like half and half, and they are well integrated together, and they function harmoniously rather than in a fragmented, neurotic way. That is the highest ideal, and that is exactly what you will become if you go all the way with your spiritual work and you fully actualize the absolute. You will transcend masculine and feminine, and when you do, you will discover a joy and a strength which is so much more powerful than any kind of red pill, hyper-masculine, Mogtown nonsense that you've been studying or learning, or any kind of pickup nonsense that you've been studying and learning. This will be a power that transcends mortal power. You will become a god, integrating it all. And that's when you will finally be at peace, and that's when you will finally be able to love, and that's when you will finally understand everything, and that's when everything will make sense to you, and that's when you will transcend all this crazy dualistic back and forth tug of war nonsense that you've been engaged in your entire life. This is what you're looking for, is you're looking for the ultimate integration. You're looking for the ultimate unity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in part 2, when we really get to the deep existential dualities. We still haven't gotten to them yet. This is still the beginning of this series. Finally, though, I want to end on a funny note, which is the duality of cat versus dog. Most people think that there's a cat and there's a dog, and you can't have both. Well, I would challenge that. I would challenge that. Well, the way that Nickelodeon did with the cartoon Cat Dog. It's a funny cartoon I used to watch when I was back in the 90s, late 90s, this cartoon came out. Funny cartoon about cat dog. Seriously, though, human beings will be able to genetically engineer animals. We're already starting to genetically engineer even human embryos. It's already happening. So it's only a matter of time before we start to genetically engineer animals. And you better believe that some scientist will figure out a way to take the genes of a cat and the genes of a dog, blend them together in some weird way, and come up with some sort of hybrid. So the reason I'm telling you that, it's not just some interesting science fiction fact. I'm telling you that to show you how your categories are not as solid as you think they are. And I'm also telling you this so that you prepare yourself mentally and psychologically, prepare yourself for the radical changes that are coming in the future. Our technology is accelerating. Crazy shit is going to be happening in the next 100 years. Prepare yourself, prepare your children for weird stuff that's going to be happening. We're going to be mixing man and machine, man and animal, and man and plant, and all sorts of stuff is going to be mixing man and woman. Like, shit is going to get mixed up in the future. We're moving towards greater integration. So you need to start to appreciate that, open your mind to that, and not get so stuck in your own categories. All right, that's it for part 1. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2. That's going to be the culmination. That's going to be the whole point of part 1, where we're going to be talking about scientific and existential dualities. See you then.